At 11:41 p.m., Iran went dark. Not one city, not one province, not the specific localized power disruption that infrastructure targeting produces when the strikes address individual generation facilities or transmission nodes in the specific sequential pattern the 9 consecutive nights execution has been maintaining the entire national power grid simultaneously. In the specific cascade failure pattern whose occurrence the Iranian Grid Management Authority's emergency protocols, whose existence the conflict's preceding months of infrastructure pressure had been building toward requiring, were not designed to address at the national scale the 11:41 p.m. simultaneous failure produced. 91 million Iranians went dark at 11:41 p.m., not in the rolling blackout pattern that the compound pressure's economic consequences have been producing throughout the conflict's duration, as the Energy Ministry's load-shedding management has been addressing the supply shortfall the blockade's fuel import disruption has been creating. The rolling blackouts have been managed failures, scheduled disruptions whose civilian impact the Energy Ministry's rotation protocol distributes across the population in the specific pattern that managed failures distribution produces. What happened at 11:41 p.m. was not managed. It was simultaneous, total, national, and it was not an accident. The Iranian Grid Management Authority's own post-failure analysis, whose preliminary findings opposition channels operating outside Iranian jurisdiction have received through the specific technical staff networks whose communication the clerical channels operation alongside the alternative pathways. The leaked planning memorandum's implementation mechanism specified has been facilitating, characterizes the 11:41 p.m. failure as a cascading grid collapse whose initiating event was not the infrastructure degradation the 9 nights kinetic targeting has been producing. The initiating event was a software intrusion in the Grid Management Authority's control systems, whose specific technical signature, the preliminary analysis, has characterized as consistent with a sophisticated state-level offensive cyber operation. The power grid went silent because someone made it go silent, not the kinetic strikes, not the infrastructure degradation, a software intrusion in the control systems that manage the entire national grid's operation. And the specific technical signature the preliminary analysis has characterized is the specific signature whose attribution the analytical community is processing through the same framework the APT-33 attribution required when the FBI director's private emails distribution established the Iranian state-connected offensive cyber operations direct retaliation record. This attribution is going in the other direction. The software intrusion that made Iran's entire power grid go silent at 11:41 p.m. is attributed by the preliminary technical analysis to an offensive cyber operation whose state-level sophistication exceeds APT-33's demonstrated capability and whose specific technical signature the collection architecture's cyber threat library is characterizing through the assessment whose classified product the analytical community is producing, alongside the unclassified preliminary findings, whose opposition channel distribution the 11:41 p.m. failure's significance has generated. The power grid went silent. It wasn't an accident. And the attribution's direction is the specific analytical finding whose occurrence at this specific moment in the conflict's accumulated developments produces the analysis this morning requires. Here is what happened at 11:41 p.m. in the specific technical and operational dimension whose characterization the preliminary analysis has produced. Here is what Iran's entire national power grid going dark simultaneously means for 91 million Iranians whose lived experience of the 11:41 p.m. failure is the human dimension. The analytical framework's institutional focus requires to account for alongside the strategic and operational dimensions. Here is what the offensive cyber operations technical attribution means for the conflict's cyber dimension whose bilateral non-degrading exchange, the FBI director's emails and the power grid failure together have now established as a parallel operational track. And here is why the 11:41 p.m. failure's occurrence at the specific moment, when the leaked planning memorandum's 3 trigger conditions have been satisfied and the negotiated transitions implementation has begun through the clerical channel, changes everything about what the resolution trajectory's next 48 hours produce. The technical mechanism whose execution the 11:41 p.m. failure required represents the most sophisticated offensive cyber operation against a nation's critical infrastructure that the public record of documented state-level cyber operations has ever characterized. The Iranian national power grid is not a simple infrastructure system whose single-point failure produces the national cascade the 11:41 p.m. failure represents. The Iranian national grid's architecture includes the specific redundancy design whose implementation a nation whose infrastructure has been operating under sustained military and economic pressure for 18 months would prioritize as the critical infrastructure protection whose maintenance requires the redundancy that prevents single-point cascade failures. The redundancy was bypassed, not through the sequential targeting of each redundancy layer whose individual addressing the 9 nights kinetic targeting would have required to produce the cascade through physical destruction. through the simultaneous penetration of the control systems managing each redundancy layer's operation. The software intrusion addressed the control systems rather than the physical infrastructure. The physical infrastructure is intact. The control systems whose software the intrusion penetrated are managing physical infrastructure that is undamaged but unresponsive, because the control systems the intrusion has compromised are no longer executing the management functions the infrastructure's operation requires. The distinction between physical infrastructure destruction and control system intrusion is the specific technical dimension whose operational significance the 1141 PM failures attribution analysis requires to understand. Physical infrastructure destruction requires the kinetic operation's physical delivery to the infrastructure's geographic location. Control system intrusion requires the cyber operations penetration of the software, managing the infrastructure's operation regardless of the infrastructure's geographic distribution. The Iranian national grid's geographic distribution spans the entire nation whose 91 million inhabitants' power the grid provides. The kinetic operation addressing the entire national grid's geographic distribution would require the targeting solution library's most comprehensive single execution, whose scale would exceed the 140 targets 37-minute window in the specific factor that a national grid infrastructure's geographic distribution exceeds the 140 targets geographic concentration. The control system intrusion addressing the entire national grid simultaneously requires penetrating the specific software systems managing the national grid's operation. The number of control systems whose simultaneous penetration the 1141 PM failure required is fewer than the number of physical infrastructure elements whose simultaneous kinetic addressing the 140 targets execution required. The cyber operation whose sophistication the 1141 PM failure demonstrates addressed a more geographically distributed infrastructure than any kinetic operation could address simultaneously through a fundamentally more efficient technical mechanism. This is the operational efficiency that the 1141 PM failure demonstrates. The entire national grid going dark simultaneously through the control system intrusion requires fewer operational resources than the physical infrastructure's kinetic addressing would require, while producing a more comprehensive and more immediate effect on the 91 million inhabitants, whose lived experience of total darkness is the 1141 PM failure's most immediate consequence. The 91 million inhabitants, the human dimension. 91 million people experiencing total darkness at 1141 PM. Not the managed rolling blackout whose distribution protocol the Energy Ministry's load shedding management has been producing as the economic pressure's predictable consequence. Total darkness, simultaneous, national. The hospitals whose emergency generators' activation the total darkness triggered. The water treatment facilities whose pumping infrastructure the grid's operation enables and whose failure the total darkness immediately produced. The food storage facilities whose refrigeration the grid powers and whose failure the total darkness is producing in the specific timeline that refrigeration failure's consequences generate. The heating and cooling infrastructure whose operation the 91 million inhabitants' physical safety in the specific climate conditions Iran's geographic diversity produces at 1141 PM in the specific season, whose temperature profile the failure's human consequences most directly depend on. The human consequences of a national grid failure are not the strategic and operational consequences the analytical framework's institutional focus characterizes. The human consequences are the specific lived experience of 91 million people whose daily lives depend on the infrastructure the 1141 PM failure has suspended. They are real. They are immediate. They are accumulating in the timeline that infrastructure failure's human consequences accumulate in the specific ways that hospitals without reliable power and water treatment, without functioning pumps, and food storage without refrigeration, produce in the hours following the 1141 PM failure. The analytical framework requires accounting for the human consequences alongside the strategic and operational dimensions, because the human consequences are not analytically separable from the strategic and operational dimensions in the specific environment the 1141 PM failure has produced. The negotiated transitions implementation, whose planning memorandum's 3 trigger conditions the morning's accumulated developments have satisfied, is being implemented in the human environment the 1141 PM failure has created for 91 million Iranians whose power grid is silent. The negotiated transitions implementation through the clerical channel and the procedural mechanisms the planning memorandum's 2nd section specifies is the resolution trajectory's most consequential current development. The 1141 PM failure's occurrence simultaneously with the negotiated transitions implementation beginning changes the implementation's environment in the specific ways that 91 million Iranians experiencing total darkness changes every institutional calculation the implementation requires. The IRGC Command Council, whose telecommunications take over the 9 nights communication node, targeting's operational compensation required, is managing the 11:41 p.m. failure in the environment where the telecommunications infrastructure, whose control the takeover established, is the specific infrastructure whose operation the grid failure's communication management requires. The IRGC Command Council has taken over the telecommunications infrastructure. The national power grid is silent. The telecommunications infrastructure, whose operation the grid's power enables, requires the grid's restoration for the full telecommunications function, whose maintenance the takeover's governance consequence requires. The taking over's governance consequence and the grid failure's telecommunications consequence are interacting in the specific institutional dynamic, and that the simultaneous occurrence of two infrastructure failures, whose interdependence the Iranian national infrastructure architecture's design produces, when both failures coincide in the environment where the negotiated transition's implementation is beginning through the clerical channel. The clerical channel's operation is not dependent on the national power grid. The clerical establishment figures whose communication the clerical channel carries use the personal and institutional relationships whose operation predates the Islamic Republic's state telecommunications infrastructure and whose independence from the grid's power the relationship's personal character provides. The clerical channel continues operating while the grid is silent. The supreme leader, whose primary infrastructure has been disrupted by the telecommunications takeover, is communicating through the clerical channel in the darkness the grid failure has produced. The clerical establishment figures receiving the supreme leader's communication through the clerical channel are receiving it in the darkness. The assembly of experts, whose procedural convening request the planning memorandum's second terms mechanism specifies, is in the darkness. The foreign ministry, whose alternative pathway communication the planning memorandum's implementation requires, is in the darkness. Every institution the negotiated transition's implementation requires is in the darkness, except the clerical channel. The clerical channel is in the darkness too, but the clerical channel doesn't need electricity to operate. The personal relationships and the institutional trust and the theological community's communication networks whose operation the clerical channel represents have been operating without electricity for 14 centuries of Islamic scholarship and governance before the Iranian national power grid existed. The clerical channel operates in the darkness. The negotiated transition's implementation continues through the clerical channel in the darkness. The 11:41 p.m. failure has produced for 91 million Iranians in every Iranian institution simultaneously. China's bilateral channel response to the 11:41 p.m. failure's opposition channel characterization, reaching the bilateral channel's monitoring, arrived in 3 minutes. 3 minutes from the opposition channel's first characterization reaching the bilateral channel's monitoring architecture to the bilateral channel's response. The 3 minutes is the bilateral channel's response to infrastructure failure, producing humanitarian consequences for 91 million civilians in the environment where the negotiated transition's implementation has begun. The 3-minute response said China is activating its emergency humanitarian response coordination through the bilateral channel to facilitate the fastest possible civilian humanitarian assistance to the 91 million Iranian civilians, whose national power grid failure is producing the specific humanitarian consequences that hospitals, water treatment, and food storage failures generate simultaneously. China is also requesting the American side's confirmation that the grid failure's technical attribution is consistent with the offensive cyber operations characterization, whose state-level sophistication the preliminary analysis has produced. And China is noting that the grid failure's humanitarian consequences add the specific urgency whose accumulation rate the 91 million civilians' lived experience is producing to the negotiated transition's implementation, whose facilitation the bilateral channel's role requires to be accelerated rather than delayed by the humanitarian emergency the grid failure has created. 3 dimensions simultaneously: humanitarian response coordination, attribution confirmation, request, implementation, acceleration. 3 minutes. China's bilateral channel is addressing all 3 simultaneously in 3 minutes. The humanitarian response coordination is the most immediately consequential of the 3 dimensions for the 91 million Iranians whose total darkness is producing the specific humanitarian consequences, whose accumulation rate the 3-minute response's urgency reflects. The hospitals whose emergency generators activation has provided the critical care facilities immediate power continuity, but whose fuel reserves the generator operation's duration depends on, create the specific humanitarian urgency, whose timeline the bilateral channel's humanitarian response coordination is designed to address. The attribution confirmation request is the second dimension whose response the bilateral channel's analytical credibility requires. To produce before the emergency consultations agenda can incorporate the grid failure's attribution in the specific way that the attribution's direction requires to be processed. The attribution is going in the direction opposite to APT 33's FBI Director Email's attribution. The specific state-level sophisticated offensive cyber operation the preliminary technical analysis has characterized as the initiating event is not APT-33's operation. The bilateral channel's attribution confirmation request requires the American side's intelligence community analytical product to confirm the preliminary technical analysis's characterization. The confirmation's production requires the classified assessment whose completion the collection architecture's cyber threat library analysis is currently producing. The confirmation is not yet in the bilateral channel's possession. But the bilateral channel's 3-minute response requesting the confirmation communicates China's assessment that the attribution's direction requires the bilateral channel's confirmation before the emergency consultations agenda can incorporate the grid failure's implications in the specific way the attribution's direction requires. The implementation acceleration is the third dimension, whose urgency the humanitarian emergency's accumulation rate requires to be addressed alongside the humanitarian response coordination and the attribution confirmation in the bilateral channel's 3-minute simultaneous processing. The negotiated transitions implementation, beginning through the clerical channel and the procedural mechanisms, is the resolution trajectory's most consequential current development. The grid failure's humanitarian consequences for 91 million Iranians add the specific urgency whose accumulation rate makes the implementation's acceleration the humanitarian imperative that the bilateral channel's facilitation role requires to recognize as the diplomatic priority whose achievement addresses both the strategic and the humanitarian dimensions simultaneously. A successfully implemented negotiated transition restores the conditions whose restoration the humanitarian consequences require. The commercial isolation's removal in the sequenced normalization, the fourth term specifies, enables the fuel imports whose disruption has been contributing to the energy shortfall. The rolling blackouts we're managing before the grid failure added the total darkness whose humanitarian consequences are accumulating at 11:41 p.m., plus the hours the grid remains silent. The governance transition's phased restoration enables the civilian constitutional governance whose function the healthcare system's public health mandate requires to be operational for the humanitarian response the grid failure's consequences demand. The negotiated transition's implementation is simultaneously the strategic resolution and the humanitarian response, not in the conventional sense that conflict resolution produces peace whose civilian benefits follow. In the specific sense that the 5 terms implementation addresses the specific conditions whose continuation has been producing the humanitarian consequences the 91 million Iranians have been experiencing throughout the conflict's duration, and whose most acute form the 11:41 p.m. failure has now created. The Senate Intelligence Committee's classified briefing on the 11:41 p.m. failure has produced the specific assessment whose unanimous character, the grid failure's humanitarian consequences for 91 million civilians, and the attribution confirmation request, and the negotiated transitions implementation acceleration, and the bilateral channel's 3-minute response have together generated in the briefing's assessment production. The unanimous assessment is not the same unanimous assessment as the unauthorized computer access by the designated foreign terrorist organization's direct retaliation. The grid failure's unanimous assessment is the legislative body's determination that the humanitarian emergency the 91 million civilians' total darkness is producing, combined with the negotiated transitions implementation, beginning through the clerical channel, combined with the attribution's direction whose confirmation the bilateral channel has requested, requires the authorization framework's application in the humanitarian emergencies dimension to be addressed alongside the strategic and operational dimensions whose accumulated addressing the 9 nights execution has been producing. The humanitarian emergencies dimension. The authorization framework's humanitarian dimension, whose application the grid failure has activated, is the specific legal authorization whose processing the 9 nights execution has not previously required, because the 9 nights kinetic targeting has been addressing military and nuclear and governance and economic infrastructure, rather than the civilian infrastructure whose failure produces the humanitarian emergency the 91 million Iranians are experiencing. The grid failure's humanitarian emergency is not the 9 nights kinetic targeting's product. The grid failure's attribution analysis is producing the characterization that the initiating event was the offensive cyber operation rather than the kinetic targeting's infrastructure degradation. The physical infrastructure is intact. The control systems have been penetrated. The 91 million Iranians' total darkness is the cyber operation's consequence, rather than the kinetic targeting's consequence. The authorization framework's humanitarian dimension is being applied to the cyber operation's humanitarian consequence in the specific legal framework whose application the grid failure requires. The negotiated transitions implementation through the clerical channel in the darkness is the resolution trajectory's most consequential 48 hours. The bilateral channel's 3-minute response has established the humanitarian response coordination and the attribution confirmation request. and the implementation acceleration as the simultaneous priorities. The planning memorandum's 3 trigger conditions satisfaction has been documented through the morning's accumulated developments. The clerical channel's operation in the darkness has been established as the implementation's operational mechanism. The Assembly of Experts procedural convening request is in the procedural channel. All of this in the darkness. 91 million Iranians in the darkness. The hospitals running on generators. The water treatment facilities whose pumping is stopped. The food storage whose refrigeration is failing. The heating and cooling whose absence the 91 million inhabitants are experiencing in the specific climate conditions the season produces. The grid went silent at 11:41 p.m. It wasn't an accident. The resolution whose implementation the planning memorandum's negotiated transition represents is the specific development that restores what the 11:41 p.m. failure has suspended for 91 million Iranians whose total darkness is the most immediate and the most human consequence of the conflict's 18 months of accumulated developments. The clerical channel operates in the darkness. The negotiated transition continues through the clerical channel. The bilateral channel's 3 minutes has established the implementation acceleration as the humanitarian imperative. The 91 million are in the darkness. The resolution is in the clerical channel. And the darkness is the specific condition whose restoration the negotiated transition's successful implementation produces faster than any other mechanism the conflict's accumulated developments have made available. Drop a comment right now and tell us whether you think the national power grid's total failure at 11:41 p.m. and the attribution's direction toward a state-level offensive cyber operation, rather than the kinetic targeting's infrastructure degradation, changes the conflict's cyber dimension in the specific way that a national grid's simultaneous failure changes every calculation about what state-level offensive cyber operations can produce in the conflict's resolution trajectory. Does the 91 million Iranians' total darkness combined with the negotiated transition's implementation beginning through the clerical channel create the specific humanitarian and strategic convergence whose simultaneous occurrence, the implementation acceleration? The bilateral channel's 3-minute response requested requires to produce the resolution whose arrival the accumulated pressure has been building toward. Does the grid failure's humanitarian consequences for 91 million civilians whose hospitals and water treatment and food storage have failed simultaneously change the domestic political environments 37% and 58% in the specific direction that humanitarian consequences for civilian populations produce in democratic systems whose population's information consumption includes the opposition channel's documentation of 91 million Iranians in the darkness? Tell us what you think the darkness and the clerical channel and the bilateral channel's 3 minutes and the negotiated transition's acceleration produce in the next 48 hours. Share this with everyone following the situation, because Iran's entire power grid going silent at 11:41 p.m., and it not being an accident, is the moment that the conflict's cyber dimension and the humanitarian dimension and the negotiated transition's implementation and the attribution's direction have all converged simultaneously in the darkness that 91 million Iranians are experiencing, while the clerical channel carries the resolution's implementation through the darkness that the 11:41 p.m. failure has produced.